patient preference to inform decision making. And I'm super happy that Ellen joined us here today to give us first a presentation and also to join us later in the panel. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Connie. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to get to present on a project that I think is pretty exciting. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is a discrete choice experiment, patient preference study that we conducted to assess the benefit-risk trade-off preferences for newly diagnosed multiple myeloma treatment options. So the treatment landscape for multiple myeloma is rapidly changing. In the past, patients had the option of a stem cell transplant or treatment regimens that would, which is a one and done treatment in a sense, or treatment regimens that would involve generally long periods of treatment in which they had to take something called maintenance treatment. So kind of a chronic, a treatment as if multiple myeloma is a chronic condition. What we're now seeing is that there are novel therapies popping up that might be changing that landscape. One of those novel therapies is CAR-T. CAR-T is a type of treatment that uses the patient's own T cells and adapts them before being put back into their body. CAR-T is approved as early and also as late line therapy for relapsed and refractory multiple myeloma. I do have to say that at the time of this study, CAR-T was only approved in late line therapy. So there were no studies on how CAR-T performed in early line therapy for multiple myeloma. However, the treatment options for patients with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma are very different from patients who have newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. And to be able to determine whether novel treatment options like CAR-T are appropriate in patients with newly diagnosed disease, it's important to understand which benefit risk trade-offs are acceptable to patients in these early lines, where they have more potential treatment options. CAR-T is only one of the types of treatment they could choose to take. What is an interesting trade-off in this case, and I've already started alluding to it, but one of the trade-offs is that with CAR-T and some of the other novel therapies, a patient receives an upfront treatment. That treatment is associated with potential risk, and then they experience a long treatment or a long treatment-free and relapse-free period. With more traditional therapy, multiple myeloma patients would treat their multiple myeloma as if it's a chronic condition. So they would use something called maintenance therapy, but they would be continuously taking medication, which means that that they might be experiencing side effect or treatment burden for a long duration of time. So what we want to learn in this preference study was to estimate patient preferences for the key benefits and harms of multiple myeloma treatments when we'd consider CAR-T as a first-line therapy. And apologies, I have lost my, okay, here we go. Okay. So as I have now said multiple times, we wanted to do this for newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. However, it's incredibly difficult to recruit patients with newly diagnosed disease, and particularly untreated disease. I think we can all imagine that cancer patients aren't waiting around to take a preference survey before they start their treatment regimens. So to make this study possible within a reasonable time frame, we actually recruited patients across all stages of the disease journey. And what we did is we asked participants to think back to when they were recently diagnosed and to put themselves into a position in which they were recommending a treatment option for a friend who was kind of like them. They were the same gender, same age, and this friend had, been recently diagnosed with multiple myeloma. We also, in this case, specified that this person was not eligible for a bone marrow transplant, as that was the treatment context we were considering. We recruited patients through the Duke Cancer Institute tumor registry. This is a tumor registry of cancer patients treated within the Duke system. This means that these patients have a physician-confirmed diagnosis and also potential access to other clinically confirmed medical history data. And they receive cancer care across the Mid-Atlantic. So it is a regional specific sample that we looked at. These patients have experienced a variety of different treatments. And we included patients that were in remission, patients with relapsed refractory disease, and even patients that were in active treatment. The inclusion criteria for this study were that a patient had to be diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and they had to be 18 years or older, able to read and understand English, and able to provide informed consent for themselves. This might be, maybe this is a little bit of a side note, but that they're able to provide informed consent for themselves might seem like kind of a side note, but it is actually very important generally in our preference research, as patients need to have the cognitive abilities to complete these relatively complex surveys. We were able to recruit 176 patients. Here I provide some information on their demographic characteristics and their disease and treatment history. What you can see is that patients were on the older side. Mean age was 66 years old. That is in line with the kind of the profile of a multiple myeloma patient. We had a nice split between female and male patients. What we also frequently see in survey research is that we have a higher proportion of women that participating, but in this case, it was a split. And you'll notice that the majority of the sample was white, 75%. Also, what might be of note is that this was a highly educated sample. 67% had a college degree or more. Patients on average had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma about 5.5 years ago. So these were not, as I mentioned before, necessarily newly diagnosed patients. Many of them, a majority of them, had received a bone marrow transplant, which in this study would have made them kind of ineligible for the CAR T option. But again, we use this third-party decision context. And about a third, a little bit more than a third, had experienced a multiple myeloma relapse and had switched treatments as a result of the relapse or for other reasons. So the treatment attributes we included in this survey. In terms of the benefit, we included time until relapse. So how much time after you received the treatment are you multiple myeloma free? We selected the levels for this attribute based on available data on maintenance therapy and also CAR T therapy. However, as I might remind you, this study was done before there was any data on CAR T and newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. So we used our best estimates based on what was available for relapse refractory myeloma. We also included a treatment attribute on impact of treatment-related side effects on daily activities until relapse. This attribute was meant to represent that period of time during which a patient would traditionally receive maintenance therapy and the impact of that maintenance therapy on their quality of life because of the burden that's associated with this therapy. As you might imagine, these two attributes are not independent. They're quite literally they're linked here, right? So patients would experience the impact of this maintenance therapy for the duration of their relapse-free time. So that is important to keep in mind when interpreting this study and the results. So what we did to represent relapse is we created a 10-year time horizon. And during that time horizon, we showed patients that, in this example, treatment A, after your treatment, you would have 3 years of relapse-free time. And with treatment B, after your initial treatment, you would have 5 years of relapse-free time. This is still relatively easy to understand. However, then we needed to layer on top this idea of limitations on daily activities. What we presented were this idea of no limitations on your daily activities. In a sense, you would not be taking maintenance therapy. Then a potential of moderate limitations on your daily life. And then also this idea of minor limitations on your daily activities, your activities of daily living, excuse me. What you see here is kind of 3 different combinations, right? So the patient on the first row, over this 10-year time horizon that we said, would be relapse-free for 3 years. And during that time, they would experience no limitations on their daily activities. On the bottom row, what you see is a patient that would be relapse-free, multiple myeloma free for the entire duration of that 10-year time horizon. And during that time, they would experience minor limits on their their activities of their daily activities. Excuse me, I'm getting my words all mangled up. So this is how we presented this idea of both the relapse-free time and the limitations of daily activity. We also had to consider risk. So in this case, we focused risk on the chance of hospitalization due to adverse events of the treatment within the first 3 months of experiencing treatment. We also included a mortality risk in the first 3 months following treatment. Every treatment has potential risk, and we wanted to understand how patients viewed these relatively extreme risks of treatment. Here is a sample choice task. So patients were presented with 2 treatments, treatment A and treatment B. And then they were asked, which of these treatments do you prefer? You can see that it includes the 4 attributes that I described earlier. So the 10-day hospitalization and the death within the first 3 months of treatment. And then also this idea of relapse-free time with the limits on daily activities. What you can see in this example is that treatment A had a low risk or lower risk of 10-day hospitalization, a higher risk of death. It had a longer relapse-free time, but during that time, a patient would experience moderate limitations, and they were asked to trade that off with the the attribute levels of treatment be. What we found was that the risk of death in the first 3 months and the time until a relapse were the most important attributes in patients' decision making, followed by the treatment impact on their daily activities. As you can see, all of these preference estimates went into the expected direction, where a lower number means that patients wanted to avoid that particular level more. So, of course, a 10-year time until relapse was the most preferred level of relapse. No treatment impact on daily activities was most preferred, etc. What I also want to point out is that risk of hospitalization due to adverse events did not really impact preference significantly until the risk of that hospitalization reached 20%. Here's just another way of presenting those same data. So again, what you can see is that over the attribute levels that we presented, chance of death in the first 3 months was the most important attribute, followed by the length of relapse, and then followed by the daily activity limits and chance of hospitalization. What we also did is we calculated maximum acceptable risk of this 30-day mortality that patients were willing to accept for a given treatment benefit. So if you were able to take a treatment and reduce the impact on daily activities from moderate to no impact, patients were willing to accept a 6% risk increase in the risk of 30-day mortality. If you were able to reduce the increase the relapse-free time by 7 years, from 3 years to 10 years, patients were willing to accept a additional risk of 30-day mortality of approximately 9%. What we also did was we calculated choice shares. So we created a treatment profile that we dubbed the maintenance-like treatment. Patients were not actually shown this choice task. But we created something that we call the maintenance-like treatment, in which patients would not experience any risk of hospitalization and no risk of death. These are, of course, kind of very favorable circumstances for maintenance therapy. We then said that on average, a patient would experience about 3 years of relapse-free time, and during that time, they would experience moderate limitations on their daily living because they were taking maintenance therapy. And we also created a CAR-T-like treatment profile in which patients would experience about a 5% risk of a 10-day hospitalization and a 1% risk of death. They would experience a relapse-free time of 5 years with no limits on their daily activities during that time. And what we did is we calculated the choice share between these two treatments. What we found is that in these circumstances, patients, approximately 97% of patients would choose the CAR-T-like treatment. Of course, the assumptions that you can put into this model can vary, right? So what we did is we changed it up. So what if maintenance therapy had a much lower impact on daily activities? What if it was really negligible? So we saw no impact on daily activities. Then we saw that more patients would switch to choosing treatment, maintenance-like treatment, than they would in the kind of this base case scenario. What if CAR-T had a longer recurrence-free time than we had given it in the base case scenario? Well, in that case, you saw a shift towards CAR-T, not unexpected. And then we did some other analyses. So let's consider that CAR-T had higher rates of adverse events. What would we see? In that case, more patients would choose the maintenance-like therapy, right? In that case, it would actually switch over to maintenance treatment being the more preferred treatment options, with 58% of patients choosing profile A. And then finally, what if CAR T had a higher rate of adverse events, but also a longer recurrence-free time? And then you see again that there's some shifting. So that is one of the nice things of these preference methods, is that you can create, based on the preferences that you observe in the survey and the choice task that you're actually showing patients, you can then estimate these choice shares for different combinations of your attribute levels. So in conclusion, in this preference survey, patients assigned the least importance to reversible short-term side effects that could be associated with CAR T. So this risk of 10-day hospitalization. The specified levels of the severe but temporary side effects and the treatment mortality were acceptable in exchange for longer relapse-free time. But of course, that depended on the kind of the trade-off you were asking patients to make. I realized that, I realized that I forgot to acknowledge the collaborators on this project. So I have to give a really big thanks to DCRI and the excellent team of preference researchers there, particularly Dr. Shelby Reed and Jesse Sutphin, who did this excellent work. And we're very grateful for the collaboration. With that, I turn it back over to Con.
Thanks very much, Ellen. It was a super interesting study. And let's check if there are questions from the audience. Let me ask you one question, Ellen. I mean, there are, to my knowledge, CAR T therapies are developed for a variety of disease areas. Mm-hmm. Could you use that study for another disease area in a certain way, or was that the one disease area where you have done a preference? I even don't know if I can ask that question, but
it's a great question, Connie. So what I can tell you is I'm gonna answer it a different way.
Okay, good.
So I'm not gonna answer your question. But when we were conceptualizing this study, we looked at some of the other research, the preference research that has been done in the area of CAR T, and also the area of blood cancer. There has been some very interesting work, and what we were able to do is we were able to kind of pull attributes from different studies. What no other study had done before is kind of explicitly look at this particular research question that we had, which was that how important is that maintenance-free period? And so we weren't able to in a sense, we weren't able to take what had been done before and transfer it to our use case, right? We had to do our own study. Would these data be transferable, to use Michael's terminology, right, to other contexts? And I would say it depends, right? I don't think we have a good sense of that right now. So I'm not super comfortable commenting on it, but they might. And of course, this trade-off, that trade-off between cancer-free time and continuous treatment exists in other disease contexts also.
So how did you learn that this was important to patients?
We had done, and this was not described in this case study, but my team works very closely with our patient-reported outcomes team, and they had done extensive qualitative work in which the maintenance-free period came out to be, or actually it was the other way around, that the time with maintenance therapy was important in patients' life, that it impacted their daily lives. Yeah.
Great. Super.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ellen. I think we are in
Thank you.
time, and then I would now like to introduce our next speaker, who is Andrea Phillips-Beyer. Andrea holds a PhD in medical sciences from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and a master's degree in public health. And her research areas of interest are measuring individual differences in risk attitude, risk perception, and benefit-risk trade-offs among patients, regulators, and healthcare professionals. And under a collaborative agreement with the University of Groningen and the European Medicines Agency, Andrea was a national expert on secondment, providing research supporting for the EMA benefit-risk methodology project. And Andrea has, for the past 10 years, provided full-time consultancy to Actelion and subsequently Idorsia Pharmaceuticals to build a competency for patient-focused clinical research using both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And it's really my pleasure to have Andrea here and to listen and get more information about the second preference study.
Thank you, Connie. I'm very happy to be here today. To present a case study. The presentations so far have been very interesting, and I hope this one provides you with some useful information as well. So before launching into the actual case study, I'd like to acknowledge the people who have worked with us, myself, Idorsia, to develop this study and pretty much all of the work that we've conducted over the last 7 or so years, more than that, including Tommy and Sebastian Heinrich from Evidera. We formed a very tight-knit team over the last 10 years and have done a lot of work together, of which this case study is only one. So let me... Before moving into the actual study design and results and so forth, I'd like to briefly touch on a few aspects that we figure we know are important when you want to have a well-designed preference study, particularly when it's not only about informing the clinical team as they're thinking through what is important for patients, but when you plan to submit the data for regulatory assessment, that you are sure that you have followed a best practice approach and have rigorous data to be able to submit. So very briefly, it goes along the line as any well-designed study, defining your problem, describing the decision that the study will inform, and the patient group that you are interested in collecting this data from, and what interventions you will evaluate and what are the objectives. Once you've determined that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to both qualitative and quantitative work to develop and determine the attributes and the levels of the attributes, which my colleagues have already alluded to in the case study before me and in Tommy's presentation. And then designing the instrument. Again, multiple tests, pilots, to be sure that you selected and you have designed an appropriate patient preference instrument that is fit for purpose. And then the data collection, which can be done in several ways. It can be done outside the study, it can be done outside of a clinical trial, it can be done in a clinical trial. We have done it in numerous ways, particularly in this disease area. We've done in a pivotal trial and external to a pivotal trial, and it provides very, very useful data in both ways that we have tested the collection of preference data. and the data analysis, obviously to estimate the trade-offs that patients are willing to make between the various attributes that they've been presented with, and to generate the decision relative to behavioral outputs. Now, before I get into the results, one important thing to keep in mind in terms of best practice approach is that very often within a clinical development plan, it can be thought that this is fairly easy, quick to do, and that's not necessarily the case, particularly when you are wanting to use the data for submission, for regulatory submission. So it can take up to 12 or 18 months to follow the various steps, reiterate steps. So this should be kept in mind for anyone who's planning to conduct their preference studies. Very, very quickly, part of the problem definition will lead you to assessing what methods are available to address the problem, to address the objectives that you want to achieve. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a fairly good start. And as you are evaluating that and evaluating the study that you want to conduct, you will look at the pros and the cons of each of the methods that are most suitable. Some you can discard right away because of where you are in your development plan, and others you can focus on as to whether or not they're appropriate. And looking at the pros and cons of these is very important. I leave you to look at that at a later stage when you're reviewing these notes. But this is a very, very important aspect to determine that you have the right model, you've chosen the right model for your study. In our case, we conducted, as I mentioned before, 2 patient preference studies, both using a discrete choice experiment approach. I'll only present to you what we call PAUSE 1, which is the study that was conducted within the clinical trial, within 2 clinical trials. And the overall aim of this study was to look at sleep medication and to be able to interpret the data that we have from the phase 3 clinical trials from the patient's perspective. So we conducted qualitative studies to identify the attributes and the levels of insomnia treatments that are relevant for patients. We developed, tested, refined a DCE to elicit the patient's preferences for the identified treatment attributes. We quantified, these were objectives to quantify the trade-offs that subjects and patients were willing to make between the attributes that we presented to them within collecting data again from 2 pivotal trials. And we also conducted a benefit risk assessment, which is using the preference data that was collected and applying it to the results of the phase 3 clinical performance data. That I won't present, this last bullet point, I won't be able to present here today, but it is part of a study that is a manuscript that is undergoing review for publication. The secondary objectives of this study was to test whether the average preferences were different between pre-specified subject groups in the 2 studies. So age, sex, ISI score, which is a measure of insomnia, and other parameters we wanted to test, and to see if there was a difference in the average preferences between an earlier visit 4, and a later visit in the clinical trial, visit 8. And I may have mentioned before, or perhaps not, this study is already published and available if you want to take a closer look. So we did an awful lot of work within the team that was looking to develop the develop the preference study, but also prior to really deciding whether we wanted to do a preference study, there was concept elicitation, qualitative research done with digital ethnography, which is patients who are identified with chronic insomnia, which was a target population, had an app that they basically lived with the app for a week and provided us their experiences, their lived experiences of living with and treating their insomnia. We also had one-to-one interviews. And the idea behind this was to really have their day-to-day experiences with insomnia. What are the factors that influence how they manage their symptoms? And very likely, what are the trade-offs that they were willing to make in a qualitative way at this point? And then from this work, we understood, which was really not necessarily expected, hoped for, but not necessarily expected, that daytime functioning was a very important aspect of managing, dealing with their insomnia. Total time asleep, time it takes to fall asleep, these are known parameters of insomnia and have been in many, many trials. Daytime functioning has been, at that point, minorly assessed, somewhat assessed, but until Idorsia invested in creating a PRO that assessed specifically daytime functioning, no one else had assessed daytime functioning with a single PRO focused on that. So, and it came from the qualitative work again and again that this was one of the most important things for patients, which really supported the sponsors' plan and the design of their clinical trial. The other attributes that were included are risk attributes that, again, are a combination of the qualitative data we collected, phase 2 data that was available at the time that we were designing the preference study, and of course, the endpoints that were included in the phase 3 trial. And this is the presentation of the levels and of the attributes and the levels of the choice task that patients were presented with. We have all the attributes shown on the left, and the choice task would have been presented to them using a design of 24 choice tasks split into 2 blocks. And they would indicate which alternative they would prefer over these choices that they were presented with. And this, I think, is known by maybe most people on the call as the way you present in a DCE the choice task to the participants. So pilot testing and data collection. For the qualitative pilot, following the earlier qualitative work that we did, and there were, as I mentioned, at least 2 or 3 rounds of qualitative work that we did before designing the questionnaire, the DCE questionnaire. Following the design, we also had a qualitative pilot with 24 participants from Germany and from the US, to look at the understanding and interpretation of the survey that we presented them with. And this led to some adjustments of the wording of the attribute definitions. Following the qualitative work, we went into a quantitative pilot. And this was a standalone study in the US and the UK with, again, 200 participants. And there were, again, minor adjustments that were needed based on the results that we have from the quantitative pilot. And we explored there also the optimal presentation and the order of the attributes, which led to other manuscripts that are also published. And then we go into the main study, which seems from the amount of space that's given on the slide that it was the least important. But here we had 600 participants who completed the DCE across the 2 pivotal trials at visit 4, and this formed the data for which I will present the results. So we have here the marginal utility, which is, we know it's the estimates that are produced, and it measures the effect of changes in the attributes on preferences. And the marginal utilities here, as you can see, are presented for the attributes and the levels that we had presented to the participants, to the subjects, and they are estimated from the different models. The marginal utilities that are estimated from different models cannot be compared directly. So there are a number of different other outputs that that are provided that allow you to make comparisons across the attributes. Maximum acceptable risk is one. Predicted choice probabilities is another. The relative attribute importance is another, as you've seen with Ellen's presentation. And here, just to explain a bit the data that is being presented, the positive coefficient shows that the change in the attribute increases the probability that a patient will choose a treatment. Negative change in the attribute decreases the probability that a patient will choose that treatment. And larger coefficients suggest that the change has a larger impact on treatment choice. For us, in this particular study, all 7 attributes influence patients' treatment decisions. We estimated a mixed logit model, and the significant standard deviation here denotes the presence of preference heterogeneity, which is something that different models can be used to look at the data that we have, and we chose this model for this particular study. We have the relative attribute importance here, which shows that daytime functioning and treatment withdrawal were the most important drivers of treatment preferences, followed by the likelihood of abnormal thoughts and behavioral changes. And improvements in daytime functioning were 6 times more important than improvements in total time of sleep, and 5 times more important than improvements in sleep onset. And as I mentioned previously, these were 2 sleep parameters that were very important in previous studies, clinical trials, and in assessing insomnia treatments. So all treatment risks together were of similar importance to patients as all benefits together. We used an abnormal thoughts and behavioral changes to assess the maximum acceptable risk here, and the maximum acceptable risk is a measure of the trade-off and expresses how much additional risk an attribute that participants are willing to accept for changes in other attributes. As I see, I'm getting close to my time. Let me skip to, so here, very important for us, we were able to show that patients are willing to accept 31.6% of additional risk in abnormal thoughts and behavioral changes in order to improve daytime functioning from difficulty functioning to fully functioning. And patients are willing to accept 12.8 additional risk in abnormal thoughts and behavioral changes in order to improve daytime functioning from restricted to fully functioning. And this again goes back to the importance of daytime functioning for this group of patients, for this population, and underlines again the importance of the sponsor deciding to include a PRO in their clinical trial as a key secondary endpoint for the assessment of their product. predicted choice probabilities showed that when comparing the daridorexant 50 milligram versus 25 milligram versus placebo, that daridorexant had 50 milligram had a higher predicted choice probability, whereas daridorexant 25 milligram had somewhat lower, but both were significantly preferred over placebo. The using the ranking and method to interpreting the study outputs is a very important aspect of assessing the data that you have collected. So here we see that daridorexant at 50 milligram had a 57.1 chance of having the highest predicted preference and being ranked number 1. Daridorexant 25 at a 51% chance of having the second highest preferred preference rank, and placebo had a 64.3 chance of being the third rank, preference rank 3. The probability of placebo being preferred over both was 14.1%, so very low. So I wrap up quickly and leave it for a few questions if there are any. The work that was done really underlined, as I mentioned before, strongly supported the choice that the sponsor had made to include a PRO in their study, because it between the preference study and the PRO, it really emphasized what was important, what was most relevant for patients. And when the data were presented to the regulatory agencies, this really supported their heavily supported their assessment. The PRO was included in the EMA in the label, not in the FDA label. However, there were a number of other reasons why that choice was made. Nothing to do with the minimization or not taking into account the preferences of patients. But the multiple approaches we see and we found, and again, supported that preference studies are an important tool for understanding the trade-offs. There are a number of approaches that are possible for the collection of preference data. And we understood then that we were conducting the study at phase 3, but we understood really that this it should be conducted as early as possible in the life cycle to support the development strategy of a product. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Connie.
Thanks very much, Andrea, also for this very interesting case study, including showing us how the preference information adds also value on decision making, what type of conclusions you can really draw from a preference study. So yeah, let me check. Is there any question? If there is no question right away, Andrea, I have one. I'm not sure, maybe I didn't catch it, but what I would like to understand is you have said that the daytime functioning is, and this has been shown, is very important to the patients, and that you also developed a PRO, or the firm, the company developed a PRO. So how close was the matching between the PRO and the attributes of the preference survey?
In fact, it's a good question. I remember when my head of development said that when they look at the data from the PRO, it's almost, people would think that we created the data. It was so aligned, so well aligned with what we had in the preference data. So you had two pieces of information coming both from the PRO, which had been developed completely independently and earlier than the preference study, completely aligned with the work that we did for phase pause 1 and pause 2. Using completely different patient populations. So it was a beautiful study to do, actually.
Great. Congratulations. Very nice.
Thank you.
Any other question? So does not seem the case now, but I mean, if there are any questions to any of the speakers, please feel free to put this into the chat, and we will see if we have maybe still some time before we finish our panel session. So thanks very much, Andrea. Thanks very much, Ellen, again. And now we would like to start our panel session, and I would first like to explain briefly how we would like to run this. So we have 3 panelists, and I will introduce the three people quickly and soon. And we prepared 3 rounds of questions for our panelists. We will show these questions on a slide for a short time, then stop sharing so that you can see everybody. So I hope we have selected a number of questions which we assume that are really of interest for this broad audience here. If you have more and other questions, please feel free to add these questions already to the chat room, and we will see and make an effort that we can address these questions also today. So, and now I first need to really handle the technique here, because I need to share another slide set. Okay. 1 second. So that's starting now. And for a moment, I stop sharing again so that you see first our panelists. So I would like to welcome very much Laura Lee Johnson, Brett Hauber, and Ellen Jansen again. And I would like to introduce Laura Lee Johnson. She joins us from the US FDA. And Laura is the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Researches, so CDER, Office of Biostatistics. Her division supports the Office of New Drugs, Office of Immunology and Inflammation at FDA, and efforts related to patient experience data, including patient-focused drug development, what we all know as PFDD. And Laura was a member of the IMI Preferred Scientific Advisory Board. She is the FDA topic lead for ICHE 22 and has taken part in a variety of efforts related to the roles of patient experience data in regulatory decision-making. Dr. Johnson earned her PhD in biostatistics from the University of Washington and is a fellow of the American Statistical Association. And I'm very grateful, Laura Lee, that you join us for this panel session here today and for the whole BBS webinar. And then I would also like to welcome Brett Hauber. Brett, I don't see you on my screen. Do you see him? Okay, everything good. Brett Hauber is the Senior Director of Preference Elicitation in Worldwide Medical and Safety at Pfizer, and is an affiliate associate professor at the Comparative Health Outcomes Policy and Economics Institute at the University of Washington School of Pharmacy. Brett has over 25 years of experience in health preference research. He is currently the Pfizer representative on the PhRMA Patient-Focused Drug Development Working Group and the patient engagement pillar of the Clinical Research Expert Group at FPR. And Brett is the deputy topic lead representing PhRMA on the ICHE 22 Expert Working Group for General Considerations for Patient Preference Studies, so what you heard about today already. And Brett is also the industry lead for a new innovative health initiative, public-private partnership project for patient-centered clinical study endpoints derived using digital health technologies. So it's somehow a follow-up project of the IMI Prefer project. And prior to joining Pfizer, Brett was a senior fellow at Research Triangle Institute and vice president of health preference assessment for RTI Health Solutions. So I guess many of us know Brett already from that time. So I'm very happy that we have this very experienced panel here today. And now I will start sharing again, and would like to open the session with a question to Laura Lee. So FDA's PFDD program has been initiated a few years ago. And based on what you have seen so far, What type of patient experience data and studies do you want to see more? What don't you want to see again? And what type of FDA's decisions can be performed by patient preferences?
Well, thank you, Connie. And as a biostatistician, I was excited to be here today with my people to discuss patient preference studies and PFDD. And to the statisticians that are on, there are a lot of very interesting statistical questions and models and ways that we can inform our analytic plans by leveraging the work from the patient preference studies. And hopefully you heard and thought about some of that today. So I would say, across the board, what we usually need, while I am a quantitatively trained person at heart, what we usually actually need more of is qualitative work. And that qualitative work coming from, and quantitative work as well, coming from diverse and representative people that are providing the information. And I'm always sad to see very small sample sizes in a lot of these qualitative and what are called mixed method studies. And in some cases, they're reasonably sized, but often they're not. And then that diversity part, and I was glad to hear Ellen and a few others bring up, we know, this is a more educated population than what our patient group really is. So we do need to think about it. It can be difficult. Now, what we don't want to see again, we don't want to see your marketing studies. We also don't want to see studies that sound like a final truth. And that kind of gets to this idea that, while many times the types of analyses being done might even align with what you see in clinical trial analysis, there is a word of caution here. And it's not just because I'm a regulator, but I think where you start to see some of the issues come up and that regulators have concerns is, what does the patient preference study actually show? And so things can change between something being theoretical and actually experiencing something. But realistically, we know this from clinical trials as well. What happens in that phase 3 clinical trial or phase 2 may not happen when it's all out in the clinic and in general use. And HTAs balance that frequently as well. But a lot of the preference studies, it's better than nothing, but it is still squishy. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't talk about that preferences are carved in stone, because we know that they're not. And I think for FDA, it is a part of information. It can be informative and provide some context, but these studies do not make a decision. I say that, however, there is next to never going to be a single study that comes in that is going to make our decision. So that's hopefully answered some of these questions here.
Thanks very much. And I always would like to invite Brett and Ellen, if you would like to respond to any of these questions as well, please speak up. Anything you want to say right now?
Yeah, this is Brett. I'll jump in. Thanks, Connie, for the introduction, and thanks, Laura Lee, for your response. I have to say, I haven't heard the adjective squishy used before to describe the work, but I think the point is well taken. I think it is the one thing I wanted to comment on, where I absolutely agree with Laura Lee without exception, is interpreting the data of preference studies correctly. What is it that you actually have? And I don't see it from a regulator's perspective, but I do see it working with colleagues internally and reviewing manuscripts for journals, there is a tendency to overstate the implications of a patient preference study. And this is one area where the perspective of statisticians kind of reins us in a little bit and says, because statisticians, at least the ones that I work with and the ones that I know, are trained to think in terms of what is it that we are actually estimating, and are very good at keeping us from overstating the implications. So more than anything, I think that is something key that we need to all be conscious of when we're doing patient preference studies and trying to use them as evidence as part of the totality of evidence that's being used in any decision.
And thank you, Brett. Brett and I had a lot of fun together with Prefer, along with everybody else. Yeah. but I also, something I feel to add is like, a lot of times the focus becomes very benefit risk and like go, no go, approve this drug, don't approve this drug. But there are a lot of other ways that, statisticians can use the information. I think some folks alluded to this, what is our testing hierarchy going to be? And it sounds like I need to learn more about what's going on with IGWIG, it sounds like. But thinking about like what endpoints should we be including? And we've seen this type of information that comes in to help support that case. Why do we think there should be a change? And Ellen and some others also mentioned, thinking about the PROs and that there could be borrowing of information across different spaces. But also one thing that we're very interested in is how you can use some of the methodology to actually develop the scoring algorithms for these multi-component endpoints. So when you're trying to put several different assessments in to have a single endpoint, instead of looking at them individually only, then how do you weigh those? What are those clinicians thinking? What are the patients thinking about to try to decide that they feel better or they don't feel better? And some of these methods can help us to start deriving those scoring algorithms that can then be additionally tested. So it's a variation over how we've done our clinical outcome assessment scoring development, but I do think it's one I'm pretty excited to see more work on. And it's very statistical in nature for those of you all that might be interested.
Thanks very much, Laura-Lee. I like your encouragement of the statisticians. So then let's go to the next question. If I'm able to, do here. Okay. Now, so Brett, that question is for you, or two questions. What type of patient preference studies do you feel is already considered impactful in industry? And are there types of studies which need more advertisement? Specifically, what role do you see today for patient preference studies in drug development?
I think the area where in really looking at development, so and thinking in terms of the evidence package or the evidence that we need to develop to support a patient-centered product, and stepping back from what would be a regulatory filing in the end and the benefit risk conclusions that we might draw using patient preferences. I think the biggest area, and Laura-Lee alluded to this already, and there's already been some discussion around this already, is determining how important certain endpoints are relative to, let's say, a well-established primary endpoint. So we may know, for example, that a certain endpoint will be the primary endpoint because that is what is recommended for use in certain clinical studies. And then we have other secondary endpoints to choose from. And one of the ways to choose that, and ultimately then the hierarchy, as Laura-Lee was mentioning, is which ones of those outcomes are important to patients. That's a decision that has a lot of input from a lot of different areas, but sometimes feels a little arbitrary. And having patient preference information in the design of a trial from that perspective, what it is we're actually going to measure to support our understanding of the impact of a treatment is something we're seeing a little bit more of. And I'm excited to see that. And I think that is one of the ways where we can make probably the greatest impact on a clinical development program. Another I want to contrast that when we talk about trial design. There are other ways that we can use patient preferences to understand what makes a better trial in terms of process. And I think that's important. And there is some work that's going on in that area because, recruitment and retention are challenges, trials are burdensome, et cetera. Asking systematically, understanding what it is that patients would prefer in terms of the conduct of the trial is important. But I really am excited, and I think it's an enthusiasm I share with Laura Lee, that this understanding where endpoints fit in, maybe, as one way to think about it, or what the relative importance of an endpoint is something that patient preference data can inform.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. And let me go to
and Brett, if I may expand, I think what I'm seeing that we're doing a lot right now is we are getting patient preferences on attributes or information that have already been deemed important by somebody else. So we get preferences on, and I think what would be such a wonderful way to move is that we start collecting patient preferences on what patients have identified as important. And there's a different role and a different time to do that, right? But I think getting that type of study out there is maybe one of the next steps.
I agree completely, and if I can just share some thoughts that came to mind while you were raising that point, I think once we're in phase 3 or in a pivotal study environment, we're stuck with the data that's going to come out of those studies. Right. So if we do preference work, then at that point, it is really a matter of trying to understand the patient's views and the importance of the endpoints and the meaningfulness of changes in those measures from the patient's perspective to provide context to the evaluation. But the parameters in many ways are already set, and we have to react to that, as opposed to being able to bring systematically and quantitatively and qualitatively as well. I don't want to diminish qualitative work, but I'm a quantitatively trained, bringing in the patient perspective to inform the decisions that lead to what it is we're going to measure. And I think that's what Ellen was referring to is distinct and needs to happen before we're stuck with a set of endpoints, right? Because then we're boxed in a sense, and it makes it easier, frankly, when we're in that position because we know what is going to be measured, and then we need to determine how that gets included in a preference study. So in a sense, it's more direct, but what we don't know a priori is whether those were chosen with the patient's views in mind when they were chosen. And there's a balancing act there too, because what makes a good clinical study endpoint may not align with what's important to patients. So it's not, let's just start with what's important to patients, start with a blank slate, build up and measure it, because some of those things may be difficult to measure, or there aren't the tools to measure them, or they just make really bad endpoints, right? We all know what a good endpoint is supposed to look like in a clinical study. So it's a working together there in that development that kind of goes away. That opportunity goes away once the protocol is for the phase 3 or the pivotal study is set, right?
And Brett, I would even add on to that to say sometimes even phase 2. because realistically, how I'm going to, before I came to FDA, how I was powering my trial was based on the information that I had out of phase 1, phase 2, animal studies, et cetera. But I do agree, and this is something that we've talked about publicly as well, that we talked to the prostate cancer patient, sexual function, huge issue for them. The surgeon handled that. Like all of our oncology drugs are probably not going to be impacting that. So you do have to think, like, what is your product going to do? Mm-hmm. And that's an important part that works into it. But there is, as you all mentioned, that shift, but it's hard. I know in industry, people are like, well, let's save it to the end. Like, well, I don't know if it's going forward. Why am I spending even more money on it? But it is going to be very difficult for me as a regulator to put much credence into any version of patient preference study where work is not started with the patient. And that's not, we want the clinician's input and the caregiver's input, but I've never seen a pharmaceutical company forget to talk to their KOLs and some clinicians. They do forget to talk to lots of other people. But putting it all together and having this is our supportive package and why we're moving this way is part of what we're looking for. But I think these are all great points.
Thanks very much. Really great. Ellen, I would like to ask you this question. And I know that we have, I'm quite sure at least, that we have people from HUR here. And in the past, patient preference studies have been primarily run by HUR, often as primary market research. Now, we heard several times today already that we would like to have more statisticians with us. So why do we need now statistician support and their support for the analytics part of the patient preference study?
Yeah, so I think, I'm trained as an economist, Brett's trained as an economist. This is not a dig on economists, right? But I think what we're seeing is that the decisions that preferences have started to inform are no longer necessarily in the economic sphere. And particularly when you're working in the trial space, I think it's incredibly important to get that biostatistician point of view because they understand trial design. They understand the types of questions that health authorities will ask. So that's maybe a very practical consideration, right? Like knowing the questions you're going to have to answer, your regulator is going to come back to. And then, of course, there are things that I think statisticians bring in to, particularly maybe in terms of study design. Sample size calculation and preference studies is a hot topic that I don't think anybody really has a clear answer on, but we know that statisticians have lots of thoughts on sample size calculation, and bringing those thoughts into the discussion is only going to be helpful in designing this study. I think what Brett had already been alluding to, when you're interpreting your results, having a statistician on board to kind of keep the team honest in terms of the inferences that you can draw, incredibly useful. It's not to say that other people in the team are trying to overstate the case, right? But people are excited about their study. They want to get it out there, and having somebody that understands the statistical inferences that you can draw is just incredibly useful. And then what we're also seeing is kind of different methods popping up. So Andrea and Tommy already had a little bit of a side conversation on, multi-dimensional thresholding. And those methods, and even the more traditional methods, can only benefit from having perhaps different statistical insights into how you can analyze those data to, present the most accurate representation of the patient's preference. So I think maybe the question really is why would you not want a statistician involved? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great.
If I
Brett?
can jump in here,
Mhm.
I agree totally with everything that Ellen has said. I have two thoughts that I'd like to share. One is we have this tension, issue, rivalry, whatever you may call it, between what is market research and what is patient preference information, and how do they differ. The position that I have on that is market research generates insights, right? It is meant for us to get a relatively quick snapshot that helps us make some decisions so we're not making them blind. Whereas patient preference information is evidence. So our patient preference studies fit into our non-interventional study category, as opposed to market research. They're governed by two totally separate processes here at Pfizer. So I just wanted to kind of get that in. With regard to statisticians, I've just very recently had an example that helped me crystallize the why I need a statistician argument. And in this case, there was a study that had started a little while ago, a patient preference study, and it was designed to align with the endpoints in a clinical study. And so it was for benefit risk analysis. And I was sitting with the safety statistician from the team in the program, trying to make sure that we were using the right safety data from long-term safety studies as our input into our benefit risk analysis. And we had a really great discussion because I'm not a statistician. So and I think I know how to read those data, but I don't, right? That is my colleagues are extremely well trained and know those data inside and out. So first of all, for me to be able to use them, I need that expertise. But the conversation that we had started being around, she was saying to me, you should have, right? It would match, it would align better if you had, right? So we're looking at sort of a post-mortem at this point. And we had some of these great ideas about how if I understood those data better from the beginning, I could have designed a better study for that purpose. I am not capable of doing that without a statistician who knows exactly what those data are the properties they're going to have. We don't know what the results are going to be, but at least we'll know what the properties are and what it actually measures to ensure that what we're measuring in a patient preference study aligns with the data to which we plan to apply it, right? So that was for me was somewhat of a revelation, and helps. So the two of us now are kind of on a crusade to help our colleagues, understand why it's so important and why we need their help at the study design stage in order to be able to get a study that can reasonably say something about our clinical data.
Mhm. Thanks so much, Brett. Laura Lee, do you want to say anything here about this question? Maybe anything about the scientific advice and what questions FDA will ask us anyway?
And it does, scientific advice varies on each situation. It's interesting because there's always this tension where people want to know what the answer is going to be in advance from a regulator, but then they always believe they have a very unique situation and want a unique answer. And
Sure.
so there's always this tension. But Brett, I was thrilled to hear what you said, because I do think that's a really important point. And it's something that comes up quite a bit as our folks are like, okay, I can do the math. Like, they can look it up. They love learning things, right? Everyone likes this. And so, but then we find it's like, oh, well, this has been a major safety issue and it was never asked about. Well, that's a problem. But it's also to this point of saying, like, who is the study for? And I think that's where some of the professional societies have also said, like, I work at the US Food and Drug Administration. We are not allowed to consider costs in our decision making. So if I am the person who is designing the preference study, I'm not supposed to be asking people about costs, even though that may be the number one driver as they're making certain decisions. But if you're an HTA, if you're other groups, there are reasons that you do want or don't want information in. But I think especially understanding the data and talking to folks to think through, but we also need statisticians to understand it's not just the numbers. Mm-hmm. A lot has to happen beforehand. And that's an important part of our discussions. But I do think the models are getting more and more complicated. But what I also, this was true 20, 30 years ago, it's true now. A lot of times we call these models by different names, but they've learned them in the econ department and the psych department and in mathematics and in statistics and in biostatistics, like they're there. And so calling on our knowledge and the publications different groups have had can really help answer some questions that are problematic.
Thanks so much. Yeah. So I see already we will not finish and be able to go through all the questions which we have prepared, but let's see how far we get. Laurelie, we certainly, all the people from industry are always interested about the FDA's thinking about that especially that we know that patient preference studies are a topic of interest. So I would like to ask you whether you can give us some insights on how the topic of patient preference studies is discussed within CDER at FDA. For example, what is your experience in discussing the need and design of patient preference studies within the agency? How do you train your own statisticians and colleagues? How much is CDER different from CDRH, the device division, where we have just seen an updated guidance? So you can imagine that we have all these questions. Maybe you can give us a bit of an insight here.
Sure, and I'm also going to try to keep an eye on the clock at the bottom of my screen. So I'll start with the bottom, and it's something that we like to say a lot around FDA, which is good science is good science. Everything does not need to be in a guidance or guideline. So good science is important. So in that sense, CDER and CDRH are not different. Now we are different because we have different regulations, so laws that govern us. So they're different. They have clearances and approvals and a whole bunch of other things that are different than how CDER does their business. You'll notice in their guideline, they have a lot with the word voluntary, and that is because, again, of the legal aspects involved. So I would say, though, from a scientific standpoint, like there are many times that I send the consult to folks at CDRH to help us out scientifically. And, CBER sends consults to us to help them out scientifically. So we try to find the best scientists to help us answer the questions and then work with the regulatory folks in each of the centers to say, okay, how much can you ask or not ask? What can we do? How can we use it based on our regulations and interests? But as I mentioned, our staff are very curious. So we do a lot of, we'll bring in sometimes university courses in-house or hire academic experts to come in short-term, people from other agencies to, what is this topic? What are the reviewer guides that we might need? And so they will help augment staff to think about what are the trainings we need to do. So, in a clinical area that may start seeing a lot of preference methods, we may concentrate efforts there. Or so before we meet with industry, we have internal meetings, right? Maybe something normally would have been one internal meeting, but now it's coming in with a patient preference study. We know this group doesn't know it all that well. So we say we're going to actually have 2 to 3 internal meetings to kind of do more training first and get people thinking about it. and then to have more discussions, and then to really kind of finalize what our comments are going to be. So those are ways that we talk about. Now, sometimes our advisory committees bring up a question, but sometimes it's our staff as they're struggling trying to make decisions. Something will come up and we'll say, one way that you could solve this is using this type of, like, you could do these different types of studies. And so we have regular meetings to discuss kind of our more difficult cases. And that's where some of these conversations come up. But it is both from what you all submit and organic. And sorry, I talked longer than I meant.
No, thanks very much, Laura-Lee. And some of us had already scientific advice meetings with you. And I mean, from an industry perspective, I can just encourage other companies to do this. It was really a pleasure for us. We learned ourselves also a lot. And I find these scientific discussions extremely helpful to come to a good study design and execution. There is one topic or one question which I really would like to raise here before we come to an end today, because this is such an important topic all the time. So we have still, I think, somehow distinct population and experts on patient preference information and PROs. Therefore, Brett, help us. Many statisticians and other experts in our drug development teams are familiar with patient-reported outcomes. Patient preferences are still often new to them. So how do you link preferences and PROs, and what recommendations do you have for statisticians, PRO experts, and preference experts?
It's a great question that we continue to deal with, but I think we're making progress. So the key letter in either a COA or a PRO is the O. It's the outcome part. We are measuring in a COA or a PRO what is happening at the time of the measurement, or maybe what has happened during a look back period, right? So those are statements of fact, let's say. That's why they are measures that can use to look at how a treatment, particularly a drug, affects whatever, and because we can see how that measure changes. So as such, they need to have all of the properties of a good outcome measure. Preferences are judgments. They're based on an opinion, if you want to think about it that way. I try not to use that, but they are based on people's judgments about the relative value of the different aspects of whatever the question happens to be. So there are two ways that I see that preferences and PROs can be used together. One I've already mentioned is when we have multiple PROs, or we have multiple endpoints of which a subset or one is a PRO, we can use patient preference information to understand how important the outcomes that are measured in a PRO are relative to other endpoints. The best example of that so far, that line of thinking right now, is I guess it was the CASA-Q that was used in the respiratory program for COPD by Novartis, and understanding how the importance of cough and sputum were to those patients relative to the more traditional endpoints of exacerbations and lung function. That is valuable information. It doesn't tell us how the lung function changes, the mucus changes, the cough changes. It tells us how important those changes are relative to something else. So that's one way to do it. Another way that there's been a lot of discussion about is different items that are measured in a PRO likely, and I think all the evidence shows this, are not necessarily equally important to patients. Some of them patients would prefer to achieve, have much greater desire to achieve than others. Now, so preferences could be used to weight the importance of those. Now, the big challenge is linking those two together, because the theoretical foundations are different between the two I have a colleague who thinks item response theory is going to solve this. I don't know item response theory well enough to know whether that's going to happen or not. But there is real information there that patients can share for us. So that is something I think we would like to see moving forward. But we need the understanding of the psychometrics and all of the statistical properties of those measures, and work with statisticians to understand the properties of our measures and how we then can see where the common ground is or how we need to adjust one for another. Okay.
Thanks very much, Brett. And now at this point, we reached the end of our meeting from a time-wise. And I would like to use that to really close the meeting and thank again every speaker, the panelists, my co-organizers, Bibiana, who has recorded that meeting and helped us in preparing the meeting, and everybody who stayed until the end. So it's really nice to see that so many people took these full 3 hours. Thanks really a lot. I wish you a rest of the day, nice rest of the day, and we will publish and post the slides and the recording on the BBS webpage. And I hope we will have another meeting like this in the future where we can see more examples and see also how the world of preference information really evolves. So thanks everybody and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Connie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Connie. Goodbye.